Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy. The topic for today's video is armour and fencing. So this was inspired by a few museum visits that I've had over the last couple of months, where I saw some nice suits of armour and some nice swords, and it got me thinking about how these two things would have interacted back in the original historical periods. So for the sake of today's video, I'm going to focus on the era from the middle of the 16th to the middle of the 17th century, which is my primary area of interest for fencing. So why do a video about this? Well, firstly, many people's idea of armor and what it is and how it was used comes from Hollywood films, or television shows, or maybe fantasy books and games. And inevitably, how armour is shown in these sources is usually wildly inaccurate. In fact, most of the time, armour is worn by characters essentially for decorative purposes, so to identify different people as being heroes and villains and so on. So I want to explore a little bit about the realities of armour from this era. And I want to relate it to fencing treatises. Now, almost all fencing treatises of this period, so roughly 1550 to 1650, show unarmoured combatants. However, numerous authors also include in their treatises advice about how useful their art is for soldiers. And in fact, some of the masters even kind of conflate soldiers and good fencers as being essentially the same thing. So I want to explore that concept a little bit and try and understand how armour would change the approach to a fight if you're armed with a sword. So let's get into it by talking about a few examples. Okay, so what we have here are three nice examples of early to mid 16th century plate armour, or plate harness as it's sometimes called. This is high-end stuff, so it would have been worn by knights and other high-status men-at-arms. It consists of overlapping, shaped and articulated plates of tempered steel. There are very few and very small gaps in this armour. The inside of the elbow joints, perhaps, the armpits, little bits at the back of the legs, very small eye slots. But aside from these weak points, this armour is basically impervious to swords. It doesn't matter what type of sword you're using, doesn't matter if you're cutting or thrusting, you're not going to penetrate tempered steel plates by striking with a sword. So it doesn't matter if you've got a rapier or a backsword or an arming sword or even a falchion or something like that. You're not going to get through this type of advanced plate armor with these weapons. Your only option if you are taking on this person on foot, one-on-one, and you're armed with a sword, is really to wrestle them to the ground and maybe try and sneak the tip of your sword in for a thrust through one of the aforementioned weak points. Or if you're lucky, maybe you'd manage to lever up their visor and then attack their face. Yeah, if you're armed with a sword and you're taking on somebody like this, your chances are not good. Maybe if you're armed with a very large two-handed sword, and very large two-handed swords were in use in this period, you might be able to inflict bludgeoning damage by just bashing the plates repeatedly with strong blows, and you may be able to knock the opponent off balance and perhaps knock them to the ground with such a large weapon. But really, if you're using a sidearm type sword like a rapier or a backsword, you don't really stand much of a chance of taking out this guy. The only way of doing damage to this would be to use a specialised anti-armour weapon like a poleaxe, maybe a halberd, or even better, a high-powered crossbow or handgun. And in fact, these are the sort of weapons that people would have used for fighting such opponents, not swords. However, all is not lost. This next photograph shows an infantry soldier wearing typical outfit, typical gear for the mid to late 16th century. So still wearing some plate armour of decent quality, but we could think of this as being maybe half armour. So the torso is pretty well protected and most of the arms are protected, but the legs are not. He's not wearing gauntlets. The helmet is a bit lighter with an open face and actually an unprotected neck as well. And this particular soldier is equipped for melee combat with some kind of polearm and a rapier as a sidearm, as a backup weapon. So this is actually more typical than the full plate armour, full plate harnesses we saw previously. The full harnesses were reserved for cavalry and in particular for heavy cavalry. So even though you see a lot of these full harnesses in museums because they are nice shiny objects and attract a lot of attention, your average soldier would be wearing something more like this. Let's see a couple more examples. So this is a close-up detail of a famous portrait of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V from sometime around the middle of the 16th century. And you can see he's actually wearing very similar armour to the infantryman in the previous picture. Obviously he's mounted here, so Charles is wearing the typical gear of a light cavalryman of the era. So the only real change between this and the common infantryman's outfit is the presence of heavy plate gauntlets protecting his hands. And of course the armour is a little bit fancier. It's gilded and engraved and there's a nice plume in his helmet and so on. But fundamentally this outfit is the same as the infantryman's. So even a substantial proportion of cavalry forces of the era would have been wearing half armour rather than full armour. This next picture shows one small detail from actually a very large tapestry depicting events at the Battle of Pavia. Battle of Pavia was fought in northern Italy in, I believe, the year 1525, so kind of early to mid 16th century. The tapestry was created shortly after that and shows typical gear, in this case, of the foot soldiers of the era. And this is interesting because we can see the sort of variety of outfits that soldiers would be wearing. Once again, we can find examples of torso protection, plate torso protection, a little bit of mail armour supporting that as well, but also just some padded clothing and things that look pretty much like ordinary civilian clothes as well. Now, an interesting thing to note here is very few of these people are wearing helmets. Many of them are just wearing hats to protect their heads. And none of the combatants here are wearing any kind of gauntlets or even leather gloves. They've got bare hands. So in an era when full harnesses of articulated plate were available, why were soldiers not wearing them? One answer is simply expense. Not everybody could afford to wear such things. But a second thing to consider is mobility. Although the weight and clumsiness of plate armour has been greatly exaggerated by old films and old books and so on, it's nonetheless true that if you're wearing less armour, you're going to be more nimble, faster on your feet, more flexible, and so on. And in particular, when it comes to helmets and gloves, these things are actually very restrictive in terms of your awareness and coordination and ability to manipulate weapons and tools and ammunition and so on. So for many soldiers, a combination of not having that much money and needing to be mobile and maneuverable on the field of battle meant that they would be wearing only partial armour or very light armour or even no armour at all. So let's return to this image from de Grassi's treatise of 1570 and think about what all this information about body armour means for fencing. So essentially, it's pretty pointless to attack armoured locations with a single-handed sidearm type sword of this era. It's just going to bounce off the armour, and in fact you're more likely to damage your sword than you are to damage the body armour itself. However, given that most soldiers and bodyguards and city militia, city watchmen and so on would be wearing partial armour, there's no reason why most of the fencing techniques described and shown in the treatises couldn't be adapted to take on such opponents. If we look at this pretty standard thrust, stoccata thrust from de Grassi's book, while in the diagram it's targeting the upper chest of the opponent, if it was aimed at the neck or face, it would affect him even if he was wearing plate body armour. So I think this is really the answer. The simple core fencing techniques could be effective against armoured opponents as well. You would just have a more limited range of targets to try to strike with your sword. And in particular, the face and neck, perhaps the sword hand and forearm and maybe the legs would be all legitimate targets. Of course, you might need to combine that with a little bit of wrestling as well. And in this rather dramatic image taken from Wallhausen's military training manual from the early 17th century, we can see just such maneuvers going on. So a little bit of grappling here and a thrust, an imbrocata thrust being targeted at the face of the opponent, and both soldiers here wearing partial plate armour, half armour. So yeah, that is fencing in action with armour in a military context within our era of interest. This final image for today's video is a close-up of a Rembrandt portrait. So the reason I'm showing this is just to briefly talk about why armour might be important to a fencer. So this in fact is a portrait of a captain or officer of a city guard regiment in the Netherlands in the first half or perhaps the middle of the 17th century. So if we think about the context of use for fencing in historical periods, which was mostly urban violence, self-defense, honor dueling, maybe political violence as well sometimes, this might be your opponent. It might be the city watch, the city guards. And we can see here that he is wearing a mixture of civilian clothing and plate body armour. So you might have to use your fencing skills against people with this sort of equipment. So my conclusion is that while not all fencing techniques would be relevant to fighting in armour, some of them were very relevant. The core techniques of systems like Degrassi's could be adapted. You would have to try to attack the unarmoured parts of the opponent and try to avoid hitting the body armour itself, which would be, of course, impervious to your weapon. But yeah, not only could you do this, but you might have to do this in certain situations. So that's really the end of today's video. As always, I hope you found it interesting. See you next time.